of the value is 24. And the pair between judging will be from our left and from our right. And now let's go into team's introductions. So, opening government.
Harvey speaking first, him.
And Isaac speaking second, he, him.
Thank you very much. Opening opposition.
Speaking first, one Leo.
Second speech. Thank you very much. Closing government.
First will be speaking Piotr, will be Brutus, and Adriana speaking second, she has this.
Thank you very much. And closing opposition.
Rick speaking first. Umur speaking second.
Thank you very much. So, I'm pretty sure you're aware that this is also a closed round, so the results will be disclosed to you before the break is announced. Of course, after that, you're free to forward to me, but my final results just give me that. Just wait for it. Okay. Hopefully we're good to go. So, without any best of luck to everyone, very good meeting to everyone, and without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Prime Minister. Here you go.
Just gonna wait till that noise is.
Of course.
Noise. Done. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think Keynesian economics is like drinking to prevent a hangover. Eventually you're going to have to stop consuming alcohol and will end up with a way, way worse headache. First point of framing. Note just for a bit of clearness, nowhere in the inputs like this are things like welfare mentioned. Whilst we might be going to conceive a trade-off on the extent of government welfare or intervention which we provide, there's probably still a minimal extent which exists within this debate. This, for instance, then means that we probably do still do things like infrastructure projects. We might also do things that are less directly interventionist in the economy, like just give people money directly through UBI. Note that really economically right-wing people like Milton Friedman were even willing to support this. We think then that there is still an extent of government services that are provided on the side of the house will just prove that there are actually better comparative to us. Note we'll concede they're smaller given a few trade-offs we prove better in the debate. First of all, why is stimulation under Keynesian economics likely not to be done well? First of all, economies are incredibly complex, as in they have incredible amounts of points of information. This means it's just very, very hard to track precisely how well it's going, but also very, very hard to track precisely which industries are genuinely productive and which are asset owners. Note, if people could easily tell which industries are asset owners, everyone would probably become like billionaires by just shorting assets. It means specifically that when people are like, 2008 happened, we can just prevent it again. Economies are probably too complex to specifically regulate one element of it, because there are almost always externalities which you can access. Especially Keynesian economics creates these bubbles inherently, which I'll explain in the second one. Second of all, governments are short-termist. As in, note that if you're a politician governing over a term in which there is like an economic recession, you probably want to solve this recession as quickly as possible within your term of government, meaning you probably do things like overstimulate the economy, you probably overinvest in things like quantitative easing, meaning you overcorrect and cause like inflation down the line or things like this. Note specifically that even if these incentives be sold inside of the house, we probably have to pay for the and therefore acknowledge that in Hayekian economics, there just aren't many ways to be short-termist. You have to focus debt reserves. You have to maintain a relatively stable budget, so there's less capacity for politicians to affect how the economy operates. Okay, what is the consequence of overstimulation but also stimulation? Note that when businesses are propped up by the government, they are broadly less required to be efficacious. As in, for instance, during a time of crisis when a government hands out loans with negative interest rates, because you have these negative interest rates, you're less worried about having to pay back this loan because the money you're having to pay back does not increase. This means companies take relatively larger risks and make investments in assets which don't have much of a short long-term prospect because the relative loss of doing so is substantially smaller. Note that when there is an excess of capital then, for instance, people start investing in things like assets because there is an expectation that the growth of this asset will be larger than the growth of the debt that the government is giving you. What this specifically means then is that when one person takes out a loan and buys an asset, the value of this asset increases, then more and more people follow this stimulating effect. Therefore, when you hand out low interest rate loans, you incentivize people to invest in assets which might theoretically have a low growth rate, but then have spiraled into unsustainable costs within the short term when you provide these loans. Second of all, moral hazard. Note that banks understand that governments are going to bail them out on the Keynesian economics. This basically means then that they have no incentive not to engage in like risky but potentially very profitable endeavors because they know that the expected outcome isn't that bad. As in, if for me as a bank, the risk of engaging in like a really risky investment or a bubble is that I either like succeed or go bankrupt, I probably don't take this risk because me going bankrupt is much, much worse than me getting $1 million. But if I know the government is going to bail me out and stop me from failing, then specifically the expected outcome is $1 million versus a comparatively minor loss. Meaning that just more banks are willing to engage in financially risky behavior because they substantially don't do things like create their own savings, create like, you know, money for a rainy day. Meaning that whenever the government bails a bank out, they create a cycle in which more banks engage in economically responsible behavior, which the government will again eventually have to bail out. What does this mean? Note that this just means then that, like, first of all, there are more bubbles which cause more economic crises, which means the government again has to service these crises by increasing government spending, which means once more it has to probably take on debt if it can't like tax the economy because the economy is in recession. Note, specifically, second of all, businesses have just emerged that are worse at handling exogenous shocks, as in when moral hazard is created, but also the standard of actually gaining capital to invest in the business is lower, so you need less certainty that's going to be profitable. More businesses are just being propped up by government debt that are going to collapse whenever there's some kind of exogenous shock, like oil prices going up, like there being a storm in your home country, meaning that collapses just happen more often when businesses are doing less to insulate themselves against it. This is once more when governments operating on the Keynesian economics have to stimulate the economy because the economy is going into recession by bailing these people out, by increasing government spending, which is again when they probably can't tax the economy because it is shrunken and therefore they shrink it further when they tax it, meaning they once more have to take on more debt themselves. Note as well, this also means they have to do debt forgiveness. This is that people took like debt from them when the interest rates are lower. All these places should go bankrupt outright, so they can't pay them back anymore. What this means then is that the government now engages in debt cycle, as in they are creating a boom and bust cycle under which each and every time they have to take on more overhead and more debt. Note this is inherently unsustainable because if this happens more and more, you either have to engage in things like severe austerity, meaning that if people were dependent on government programs, they now are removed from them. This is probably a priori worse than simply businesses existing that would have given them jobs, or at the very least they've not been constant economic fluxes, or even, and note this does happen in countries, economic debt expiring beyond your GDP or what you could ever possibly pay back, meaning that, for instance, basically your country gets taken for scraps. It gets disassembled because it's no longer able to service its debts. Note that when countries have debt crises, this is intense. This is when they stop being able to pay for police officers. This is when they stop being able to build infrastructure. This is what directly puts people's lives at risk. Even if comparatively they lose some access to welfare, they lose their base level needs when this happens, so even if it's rare, it is a more intense harm upon these individuals. I'll take a PI from closer.
So your argument confuses me because in Keynesian economics, governments can actively step in to regulate or freeze prices with bubbles. But in Hayekian economics, you have to defend a free market which means you cannot even regulate or step in when bubbles are emerging.
Okay, first of all, you have to prove that this is how politicians are likely to actually implement Keynesian economics. The problem then is that when you're operating a 4-year term, you don't often have the incentive to intervene. Second of all, it's just hard to access economic information, but the economy is better at correcting itself comparatively. With that in mind then, why are Hayekian economics just substantially better? First of all, you just don't do things like servicing debt, so companies don't engage in moral hazard. This specifically means then that the government doesn't have to bail out exogenous shocks because companies do this themselves. This means that when there's like a tornado, you can focus your money on giving people like aid relief instead of bailing out large companies. Note specifically as well, this is probably just uniquely when there is more confidence in the poorest nations in the world. As in, when the governments worse at implementing Keynesian economics are probably the poorest because they have the least access to expertise. This is when investors don't trust these countries because they expect there to be more exogenous shocks, because they expect their capital to be regulated poorly or randomly. Note specifically then, this becomes the turning point between having like Argentina or Chile. It becomes the road between hell or heaven. Look, even if it is the case that we have small welfare states, we can at least sustain them for longer when the government is not putting a massive and perpetual overhead of debt, and when countries, and when investors probably just trust countries more and therefore are more willing to invest in them, build up assets that are more productive when they have to build up businesses that actually produce a product and are not just a speculative asset.
I had this current short speech, now I can have the first speaker from the opposition.
that Keynesian economics is important to kickstart the economy to protect the most vulnerable people under the help of the government. I think the problem with opening government in this debate is that they just want to stop, but they don't actually explain that, and they do it at 100 miles per hour. And if you actually notice their case, none of it is actually mentioned in the info slide. There's no defense for why we have to, for example, reduce loads to a significant extent under banks. This is about government spending and government infrastructure. So I just think we're going to win on actually debating the motion and actually explaining why government spending, particularly in cases like infrastructure, even if it comes at the cost of debt, is just better for the average citizen, and that is what we care most about this debate. Several pieces of setup refer to arguments. The first thing is what we are likely to defend. So we are likely to defend things that are mentioned in the info slide, things like larger project spendings, like infrastructure to create ports, to create connect roads between rural and urban areas, for example, and to set up export industries. We are happy to some extent also provide funding through things like SOEs to a much larger extent, and doing things such as lower taxes to encourage spending. And even if it comes at the cost of debt, we are fine with that. The second thing to point out is that governments can and will do this sustainably, and this also engages with their case. Notably, because they can do this, they say economics is complex without real explanation. I think at the point in which governments can hire the best economic analysts, because the risk that it comes, like if your country's economic crisis is literally just almost death in a lot of cases, means that there's an incentive to hire the best economic analysts. With the rise of things such as AI, where they're able to predict economic trends, for example, and governments have exclusive access to data about the economy, such as unemployment rates, that means that they are able to predict these things. And they have the incentive to do this, right? Because people have learned from the examples that they talked about, because people have learned from the examples of Greece, and because if the economy is screwed over and you take massive amounts of debt in a way that's unsustainable, clearly that also fucks up your voter base. So the likely way in which this happens is you're likely to take on debt where it is likely strategic. So for example, you focus infrastructure in connecting different roads or different parts of the country, or you focus on specific industries that are booming, or where you have a competitive advantage in that country, such as Indonesia with palm oil. They're not going to do this in the most absolutely stupid way that opening government tries to identify this debate. I just think they're very uncharitable. All clashes will be integrated. Firstly, on why this is better for economic growth, and secondly, why this is better for economic inequality. Firstly, why is this better for economic growth? I want to talk about two things here. The first thing to point out is that we just unlock a massive amount of untapped potential in the economy. This looks like just latent productivity, because a lot of workers, for example, are underskilled and are unlikely to be trained by private companies, given the fact that there's no benefit for private companies to train them themselves if, for example, they can be bought out by another company or moved to another company. Or the fact that you just don't have, for example, connections between different parts of the country that allow for things such as free trade, that allow for things such as being able to reduce the business costs of the different supply chains operating in that country in a way that is more efficient. The second thing to point out, and this is really important, is that government spending actually encourages and increases the effect of private investment and consumer spending. And that is for 4 reasons. The first thing to point out is that you directly provide infrastructure for private companies where they otherwise would not. And the reason why is because private companies have no incentive to do this themselves, because it doesn't benefit you to build a road for yourself that can be used by a competitor, for example. And if your mechanism is giving UBI, no one in the fucking world is going to collectively create a road together, because you'd rather use it for yourself and for your selfish interest. It is only that the government can think in a more long-term sense and plan these things for the development of the economy. Secondly, I think you just create a signaling effect that the government cares about specific sectors of the economy, which means that private actors are more likely to invest. So if the government invests first in things like green technology and is willing to cop that risk, and is willing to, for example, back up the companies in that industry, that is where more private investment comes in, and that is where more confidence in the economy comes in. Thirdly, because you just increase confidence from consumers, they're more likely to spend, insofar as now they see that the government is willing to, for example, back them up in terms of welfare, if, for example, they spend now, which means that less consumers are likely to save under our side of the house and actually spend and stimulate the economy. Fourthly and finally, I just think you finally set up export sectors under our side of the house. You need things like ports. You need things such as the infrastructure necessary to initially export your goods, which means that you prop up these industries. Before I move on to impasse, yes.
Which government is so stupid that when they have ores but no harbor, will not build a harbor for their economy? All those incentives and capacities are symmetric on either side.
The problem is that you have to have limited government intervention, so we just do it in a much larger extent. You have maybe the necessary prerequisites for some of these to occur. You just don't unlock the untapped potential because you say, well, private companies will do this in a much better way under their side of the house. What is the impact of this? The first thing to point out is that you often create more jobs and you just prop up more industries. And that is good because of the money multiplier effect, right? Just because when people have more jobs, they have more purchasing power, they can spend it more on other sectors of the economy and prop themselves up as well. Which means that for every single dollar of government spending put under our side of the house, the benefit is exponential, and that is something that's really good. Secondly, it also just allows us to better insulate against things such as crises because of the economic growth and because of the profits that is gained from these industries. Means that the government have a lot of capital buffer to, for example, spend on welfare if there's an economic crisis or to restart that under their side of the house. So we just went on long-term growth, even if to some extent they get infrastructure, which per their opening, right, you say you don't want to do this because you want to give people UBI or whatever, and you want government spending. I just think that we get far more of that benefit under our side of the house. Second argument as to why this is better for economic inequality. I think there are two problems with this other form of economics everybody. The first thing is that you just have no deficit spending. And so, the way governments are likely to raise money for, even if they want infrastructure under their side of the house, is not through things such as saving on debt, it's through things such as raising taxes, if that is the imperative that CG wants to depend on infrastructure. The problem with raising taxes is that it often leads to a tax burden on the most vulnerable population. That is A, because factually in most parts of the world there is no progressive tax, and if no side of this debate wants to cannot play fiat in this debate, right? There's also no fiat for this progressive tax. But B, because the negotiating power of the poor and vulnerable is very small in these instances, because the poor can't threaten to, for example, threaten against private companies or whatever, but they can directly threaten the government by the mechanism of the vote under our side of the house. Secondly, I think market failures are likely to happen in a free market at the expense of private companies. Firstly, things like negative externalities, where companies don't care about pollution because the harms don't come to the company, it comes to literally everybody else who is affected. Second, things like natural oligopolistic tendencies in industries where there's high startup costs. And thirdly, the fact that companies are just beholden to private interests, so they will always race to the bottom and try to cut costs. They will always lower labor standards, for example, in the way that they operate because it was benefits their bottom line. On the comparative, I think governments are actually likely to do this in a way that favors poor people. The first thing to say is that governments are democratic. Even in the case of minorities, for example, governments have to be beholden to minorities because they're often the swing voters in certain instances and can form a significant voting bloc. But second, because governments are long-termists, because most people or government officials go for 2 or 3 election cycles. They don't just do it for 4 years, right? You have a legacy that you want to maintain, so you care about long-term growth. And thirdly, even in the most authoritarian states, people protest. Which under our side of the house, governments do care about poor people. They're likely to spend this in a way that's well. SMEs, for example, care more, and that is why we're very high standard.
Thank you very much for the speech, and I'd like to invite the second speaker for the government.
Just a few things in this debate. No, I think what's important to show in this debate is that there is it's the point of deficit spending on the ways to stimulate the economy, that this is the primary way Keynesian economics it manifests itself. AKA, it's when you're in times of trouble, it's when you start overspending, over-leveraging yourself. No one's interesting about opening government is that they literally mechanize our case. Note that they say this weird thing that you're more likely to save on their side of the house. Note when debt is cheaper, when assets are more growing in value, that is when you overspend. Note that is because you believe you can create greater value in the future. Note on our side, when there is no certainty that you will get bailed out when your market overspends. Note when assets are probably more speculative and therefore can collapsible. You invest in businesses to a greater extent because there is certainty that they will be providing assets and employment in the future. They'll be developing jobs. Note that this means that it's a more likely thing that you will invest in, and therefore it is of course on our side of the house. Note, they talk about infrastructure. I think one thing that a few things about this. One, there's probably some private incentives to do this anyway. Note, have you ever heard of a toll road? Have you ever heard of trains building railways themselves? Note there is an incentive to make profit off this. Note that it's probably marginally better when you have that level of competition between them. But even if it's not that,
note the state can still probably access this, but the access is this bit when it's not servicing, when it's not engaging in debt spirals and that. Also, they go, oh, but this isn't to do with debt or loans at the start of the speech. Note something that's quite important about that. In the literal info side, it talks about quantitative easing. This is about increasing and decreasing interest rates, and this is literally what was said in the announcement hall in motion clarifications. Maybe they should have been there if they wanted to engage in this piece of information. Note that this is the exact mechanism that impacts our case. So therefore, I think this means that we gain it in the long run. Therefore, it's good. Also, I feel like they just talk about how you can't engage in, they then say, oh, but we will access to expertise in this. Harvey preempts this quite effectively when we point out that if people could access this information and make these decisions, they would already do this and make flat tons of profit. Note that this doesn't happen in the status quo. Note that most investment companies do worse than the average stock market because they probably have internal biases, they probably have limited access to information. They then say, oh, we have access to government spending and taxes and all of that. No, they don't know why that's useful, but they don't know how I can process entire swaths of data and then make a good conclusion out of it. They then go, oh, AI. I think this is a weak argument when we point out that you probably don't, the AI is probably just trained on existing data models. No, when we point out that it's already engaged in boom and bust cycles, these are likely just to be trained on that same data and therefore engage it to the same extent. Therefore, this AI case falls out there. And then lastly, on just why the expertise are probably also going to be worse, is because the people who you hire are from these existing private equity funds because they're the people who have those expertise. Note at the point where they have that incentive to therefore benefit their friends, benefit their existing people they worked with, because they might then want to go back into the private sector again. They therefore overcorrect and benefit those people rather than the poor people that then they claim to benefit in the long run. Note also, just an annoying thing that they say, they go, oh, but the state's really good at benefiting poor people and the working class people, but then they also point out that they're actually the people in positions of power engage, they'll raise the taxes on the poor people because they don't have any votes. Note this tension in this case means that it probably just has to fall out the debate. Then lastly, even if raising taxes is on poorer people, it's probably unlikely the case because there's probably still ways that you can vote out governments. Most people are working class or middle class. They have probably greater capacity to vote against these things. Note that this doesn't mean you just flip it with a switch. Even in authoritarian countries, it's probably difficult to tax these people and then get a violent overthrow, because if you just gave them high taxes, you probably dissatisfy the people of your population. Know how, the French Revolution happened. I'll take closing.
I'm still unsure about the government how you respond to these shocks when you remove tools from the government's toolbox.
Yeah, but what we pointed out is that the people in the positions of power are likely to engage in these tools incorrectly. And therefore, and secondly, the whole point of the issue of these shocks is stimulated by them engaging in it. No, when we point out that these people don't have the access to information and they overstimulate these bubbles to exist. Maybe on their side they can answer crises better, but we see that's a bad thing when it therefore creates negative externalities, impacting and weighing this case. Note a few things. One, I think intervention probably makes the market economy harder to predict in its fact. Note this means that businesses overstimulate certain economies and understimulate this. This looks like the state funding AI, people then thinking it's a sure investment because the state is engaging it, so we overstimulate it, this then creates a bubble. Note innovations and technologies are also very complicated to understand and find out and predict. Therefore, because technology is rapidly changing every single day, therefore it's probably uncertain that these people have the capacity to do this effectively and therefore make those investments. We just say that, and because they overstimulate, when the bubble crashes, you probably are sitting in a worse position. Lastly, we should probably avoid economic harms over gaining economic benefits, because note at points where you need the welfare state is the point where they engage in austerity to try to balance the budget to lower interest rates and therefore worsen the economy. Note that this just means people don't have access to the hospitals that they thought they had. They got access to the welfare state that they assumed they have, and therefore it probably was for them. Secondly, long term, again, we see countries that engage in stimulus spending after stimulus spending after stimulus spending, means they rack up the debt. The day they can't service this, the day that they're in charge they can't service this, is when the creditors come knocking, and it's when your economy collapses. Note, this is the worst situation you could ever be, because this means happily starting from ground one. This means you never get trading loans and access to this. This happens worse in the developing countries, which should weigh countries that are developing more, because the boom and bust cycles probably impact their citizens to a greater extent, meaning that they aren't able to feed their families, survive in the long term. I think in just so many cases, we win this debate.
I'd like to do for a speech, and I'd like to invite the second speaker for the opposition.
I'm guilty of this, so I don't blame opening government. But most of their case genuinely sounded like me at 12 a.m. trying to waffle through my economics paper. Quite frankly, a lot of the things that opening government said, at face value, should be discredited. Firstly, all their talk about how banks are too big to fail apply even more on their side of the house when private companies are the instruments that banks lend to on their side of the house that governments have no control over, with things like quantitative easing, which requires you purchasing or selling government instruments like bonds and so on, which then have influence over the market on their side of the house. All their claims about how on their side of the house, like the healthcare industry is more volatile. Like on their side, private companies are the ones running healthcare, and private companies are the ones building infrastructure. What do you think happens in an economic crisis? They have no incentive to stay and build that healthcare. They have no incentive to stay and upkeep those hospitals on their side of the house. So it's unclear what the comparative was on opening government. And I think it was clear what the comparative was on opening opposition. So I'll break this down on 3 questions. Firstly, does development happen? Which I think is prerequisitory to this clash at large. If we can prove that economic growth occurs, we get jobs, we get houses, we get people to live better lives generally, we get the development of companies over time, and those are all good things that are prerequisitory to economic crises and so on. Then I'll prove is development sustainable, and I'll talk about whether or not debt financing is good or bad, and I'll respond to their stuff on crises. Finally, I'll talk about is development fair, because they had very little response to that. Firstly, does development happen? Our claim here was very simple. It was that development in many countries in the world can only occur as a consequence of active government spending into the instruments of development. This wasn't just, by the way, on our side of the house, more untapped potential, but it was literally that the alternative just doesn't exist, right? We got no response from opening government on this. What do I mean by this? On their side of the house, many countries who don't actively take out money in order to spend on massive infrastructure projects have to rely on private companies. They say, well, private companies are the to do this. Here's a couple of reasons why they don't. Firstly, it's speculative, right? It's risky to spend massive on things like roads and so on. Even if you know people are going to pay those tolls, you don't know for how long they're going to pay those tolls. You don't know if this is going to lead to more FDI, and you don't know if you're going to benefit from the FDI, right? Because you're not you're not being paid every time someone takes a loan. Second, that sounds really bleak, right? Because if the only way you can monetize basic things like infrastructure is by having a shit ton of tolls, then your incentive on their side of the house is to just put as many tolls as you can and make everything as expensive as possible, which is really, really bad for consumers on their side of the house. So development is super unlikely. 3, I think most countries that aren't like the USA or super developed countries in Europe aren't the types of countries where people have the startup capital on their own in order to develop. So either they were relying on foreign direct investment, which there's no incentive to develop a country as a foreign investor. You go towards countries that have good labor and then invest in them. No thank you. So it's unclear where you're able to get that spending. I think what all of this shows is, on their side of the house, private companies have no incentive to want to engage in large-scale infrastructure projects. They have no incentive to build things like ports and build things like machinery. Their response, I think CG's response as well, was, you're an idiot government if you don't build a port. Yes, I think you are an idiot government if you don't build a port. The problem is you can't just tax your people. Your people aren't themselves that rich in the first place, right? It's important that your people themselves have money. That only happens as economic development occurs on our side over time. That's why we think then deficit spending was so important. whether or not development is sustainable. Firstly, I think there's large instruments that understand that debt is good leverage to have over a country, and therefore are willing to give out a shit ton of loans, right? So just empirically, the World Bank gets like $50 billion in callable capital every year. Just that's money that they can't even get back. Like, that's money that doesn't even have interest on it. Just because giving that money creates good ties for these countries in the future, which means, for example, like American companies can enter your country, and that's good for you, right? Second of all, I think deficit spending is neutered by the fact that we're living in the current context of the world. To quote Kamala Harris, right? Insofar as on our side of the house, things like the 2008 financial crisis and things like the overturning revolution in Sri Lanka showed and signaled to people like governments all over the world that if you engage in too much deficit spending, that people come revolting and come knocking on your door. That's much, much worse. But three, I think there's accountability for deficit spending. There's no accountability for like loans being taken out by large private industries on their side of the house, right? So the problem was that your companies are going to go bankrupt. The risk still exists on their side of the house. The point is you take that risk less. Their response is, well, governments are short-termist. I think no, because you're beholden to your party overall. It's not one person or one leader acting, and if it is just one person or one leader acting, you're in a dictatorship, and you're not short-termist at that point, right? But B, I think companies are also short-termist insofar as they want to be able to monopolize these industries at first, right? They want to be able to make sure that they're cornering the market really, really quickly. And so they're more than likely to take out loans and stuff, which was the bullet that they had to bite if they wanted the types of development that we're talking about. So overall, I think deficit spending, even if it sometimes can go bad, overwhelmingly doesn't, as has been evidenced by the massive amount of development we've seen over time in countries like China and now in countries like India. Next, let's respond to crises. Their claim on crises was that on our side, crises are much harder to police because the government themselves is like more or less involved in some stuff about assets that I didn't really understand too well. A couple of things to point out, right? Firstly, a government's control over situations like crises and over things like the interest rate and using unconventional monetary policy like quantitative easing is not that important in this debate because most crises are resolved by central bank instruments that exist on both sides of the house. But I would argue that crises get worse on their side when there's no reliance on things like government bonds in the first place. If government bonds don't exist, then what the fuck are you quantitative easing? What happens when the financial friction causes the interest rates to go below zero and causes even more inflation? You can't do anything because private companies can't do anything on their side of the house, which means crises get worse on their side. Finally, is economic development fair? And no, we're already taking the debate massively at this point because if we've proven that development is super, super important to getting jobs, to getting FDIs, to getting private companies in the long run, to getting things like better trade negotiations, to not having races to the bottom within your country, we're already winning. But we already tell you that economic development happens more fairly on our side. A, governments are more accountable. And this is really obvious, right? Private companies want to monetize everything. B, they're less volatile. You have less things like layoffs because you have more workers' protections that people can seek out. C, even if you're kind of fucked over if you're a developing country and you have the race to the bottom, as you develop on our side of the house over time, because you want to cater to your voter base, you have more incentives to want to do things like, become more fair and offer more of these things and so on and so forth. And this is more important as well, right? Because even if they can prove that private companies do all these things, if it means that everyone in that country stays destitute, except for the very few that have the capital to do this in the first place, that's a much worse outcome. That's the outcome that we don't want. So we're winning on that clash as well. I'm immensely proud to close.
I'd like to thank you very much for your speech. And now back to my speaker.
Actually, sorry. Is it okay if I step out for a second?
Sure.
How long have you been gone?
Sorry?
Are you just going to start the whole day or
I'll just come back and please.
Okay, I'll do it.
Yeah.
panel, when you evaluate Hayekian economic policy and Keynesian economic policy, it's about the general goal. So it's not about the specific policy that you're going to implement, because the policy is going to be implemented because you're going to try to reach it. What does this mean? We have all of this incentive and capacity analysis of governments. It doesn't matter. It is symmetric. If you have bad actors, like bad regulation, you'll have that on either side. If you have no capacity to predict the economy, you don't have that on either side. What that means is you should wonder whether we in general just want an economy which is going to have the GDP growth a bit more stable, or if it's going to go up and down. What does it mean? When they say you're going to need education and roads, I think the state is willing to create this, because if you want stable growth, you need to have growth in the first place. Which means that overall, you don't want to spend money, but if you want to have growth, sometimes you need to break a couple of eggs and spend money. This takes a lot of their harms about untapped potential away. Now, then the question becomes, are in the end, states or government, like states and governments, or companies better investors? They give you some generic reasoning, but the problem is, one, the reason why you want to invest in FDI is because you can still make return later on. But secondly, know that governments have other forms of things that they can do to make you want to invest. They can sell specific rights. They can make it that you can have access to ores, or that you can have security that everything is going to be protected. Which is why why these companies are willing to invest. No, they don't just go to all these destinations, because if everyone goes, there's a huge amount of competition. It is then easier to go to a cheaper country where it's cheaper to build roads, where you have less companies, less competition. That is why you get this investment. Now, why are these also still quite good? I want to note that if you do it poorly, that these states want to go to another company and sell the rights because you're not making these promises, right? You're not leaving these promises. So you're slowly not going to exploit this kind of stuff. That is why the free market is great. It breeds competition. It makes it that when you have lower prices, it is more accessible. But also I want to note, right, if there are going to be really bad regulations, the government still wants to have maybe some form of anti-pollution, some form of labor protections, because you still have people voting for these governments. So that is out of debate, which means it's not about the worst case, you still have a lot of good incentives to do so. I will do this better. Now, what do we then overall going to say? We're going to explain why you're going to get no bubbles. I want to note that OG does make some claims that they have analysis. They just say, people use more money and they buy more and then they speculate more and then you create bubbles. I don't know why these bubbles are created, how they happen, when they are bursting, all of this stuff. Check your notes, there is not enough analytical rigor to explain these economic things. Why do actually bubbles exist in the first place? Bubbles are just quite simple. It is when you have an over-evaluation of a product. So if you have a house and it is worth overall £10,000, but now I tell Ada it is worth 1 million, and then she buys it, and then she needs to sell it because she has maybe some, prices that she has, or she wants to sell it to another seller, and then she sees that no one is willing to buy that amount of money for that specific product. That is when she's now losing a shit ton of money. What does that mean? That means that overall, the problem is specifically over-evaluation. Why does this over-evaluation not happen on our house? They just say you have more demand for these things because you have more of people money, and that does not scale up to the debt. Why? This is just words. This is not maths. This is what OO is literally saying. It is, no, you have more spending, therefore you can afford these things, therefore these things are growing. What is then the problem? Firstly, when the moment of the arch of the house, big companies are suddenly growing massively or massively expanding, or you have highly speculative things such as AI popping up, you are much more likely to regulate this on the arch of the house. Why? You want stable growth. So when you have all of these companies suddenly popping up that you don't know, what are you going to do? You're going to first put in regulations, which means you're going to put caps on the amount of investment you can have in the speculative thing. You're going to put in requirements in amounts of money that they need to leave back in the first place. So when a crisis hits, they're able to use this money themselves and the government does not need to bail them out. That is why you have these regulations. So yes, sometimes free trade is great, but because it's about creating growth, you are going to step in and you are going to regulate as any normal government would. But secondly, I also want to note, this is about narratives in society. This is about when you go to school, you are learned or Keynesian economics, it is fine for prices to happen. Bubbles just happen because people just spend and sometimes they cannot default. And this is okay because they get more growth. But when we say, no, this is bad overall, we should try to limit it, this also means that investors and companies want this. That's also why people also want this from these politicians. That is why you get this kind of policy. This is also why you're able to stop this, because you don't want this huge explosion. You want to have more security, and that's what you're going to value culturally and economically. Why is that significantly also more likely to have an undeserved house, right? Because the problem is, when can I make this over-evaluation? It is when I can lie to Ada and say, Ada, it is worth 1 million. What is the problem with this? This is not a free market. When there is such a huge asymmetry of information and power, and I can make oblige, she cannot enter the market. She cannot engage with it fairly. So to have a free market, you need to have these kinds of regulations. But secondly, it is also when I am a big company that has huge amounts of power, which is able to dominate the market. When I'm able to dominate the market, so then lower prices unfairly, when I'm able to bribe all these officials, when I'm able to do all of this stuff, it also is unfair for other competitions because they can't do it. You can't have this free market, therefore you require this kind of analysis. Therefore you stop this because you're going to have more spread of companies. That means you don't get those super big banks that go bankrupt and then you suddenly need to build them out. You're going to have less of these companies, you're going to be more stable, have more of these reserves. Umar, go. Okay, go.
Your method of regulating bubbles, like placing caps or preventing domination, sound like government intervention. That's why bubbles are very rare.
Oh my god, it's almost as I preempted this within the first part of my speech. It is about the goal. The goal is stable economic growth. Always governments need to implement some regulations because it is their state. You cannot have a free market without regulation because otherwise you get monopolies and when they dominate, you don't have a free market anymore. This is so basic, economic students learn it in the first year. What does this then mean? Overall, we get less bubbles. What does it mean? I think this is prior to everything. Because when you have less prices in general, you just have less bad things you need to do. Sometimes it will be done well, as OG says, where you just stable your economy and great. Sometimes it happens poorly, as OG says, because you're spending too much. We say you don't need to do this in general, but inherently to bubbles is just a lot of pressure. Like, no one even impacts this. The moment you get bubbles, you have a huge amount of stress as the average individual. You lose your job, you lose your house, all the things that you save for become useless. That means there's going to be a huge amount of stress for you. And I'm able to say, even if you get less growth on their house, you get used to things. At the moment you're not used to having a very expensive car, it doesn't matter if you lose it or if you don't have the biggest house, because you can get used to living in a small house, because you do always come. You think it is fine to have a less economic growth, because the bubbles just create a significantly less expectations, significantly more stress. For all those reasons, CG.
I'd like to thank you very much for your speech, and I would like to invite the third speaker for the opposition.
Firstly, I just want to deal with the very problematic framing by CG. I think they are crossing the house slightly. I think they have to defend a free market and they have to defend a market which are just significantly less robust. I want to first deal with top down because I think that both teams aren't really grounded in true economic realities. OG tells you that every country who does Keynesian economics is like Greece. They spend money when they're in crazy debt and they enter into more debt. All do this kind of well-bound to provide an ironclad certain response to why deficit spending can be controlled. The fact is simple. Countries literally cannot overspend now due to post-2008 international regulation. The US passed the Dodd-Frank Act and prevented government investment in hedge funds to get less reckless investment. The EU mandates they have to maintain no more than a certain debt to GDP ratio or inflation rate if you opt into the Eurozone, which means you can do deficit spending to a certain degree, but there's a hard cap to how much you can do it. This is a far better mechanism than O, because O relies on positive government incentives or it will view why the capacity for them to do this is just limited. But secondly, to be able to get IMF funding and things like that and get access to credit, you need to be able to show that you are financially credible, you need to be able to rein in finances. So governments desperately need this money to kickstart the economic cycle that O talks about, need to be able to rein in excessive spending in the very first place. But I think O is also slightly flippant when they explain that you can build these social services and infrastructure, because I think we agree that on both sides of the house there will be a basic level of infrastructure to facilitate a basic level of economic growth. It's unclear what the delta is on Keynesian spending on their side. Two arguments then we're going to bring to you opposing opposition. Number one, why asset bubbles get worse and why governments have no capacity to deal with the consequences of it on government side. Secondly, on why we allow middle income countries, developing countries to be able to escape the middle income trap. The first thing to note here is what a free market entails. Free market firstly invites significant lobbying and corporate capture because companies can now form things like backdoor deals with politicians to provide greater access to credit, to land, to resources, to labor for them without meeting basic regulation. And the most important thing is that this is uniquely comparative because on outside the house, when the government is interventionist, they do things like create government watchdogs like the SEC in the USA to be able to constantly monitor these practices and ensure that these practices are rooted out of the system. This is something that O does not mention. But secondly, the free market provides the proliferation of suboptimal financial instruments, such as the things in 2008 like mortgage-backed securities, which means that investors, oftentimes the common individual, the common average investor, was putting things into money, putting their money into things like speculative housing bubbles. I think on the comparative, we mitigate this in three manners. Number one, you legitimate government intervention. And note here that this house prefers so, because in this world, there's a strong culture of government intervention whenever you have to deal with situations like this. There's a strong built-in expectation in the economy and among consumers and the society to be able to deal with these things. So that you can do things like price freezes or drastically increasing interest rates to deal with rising prices as opposed to the constant interest rates that they have to defend on-site government. But secondly, you can cut spending to ease inflationary pressures because note here, Keynesian economics is not just about increasing multiplier cycles, it's also about contractionary fiscal policy to decrease multiplier cycles to deal with excessive price bubbles and to tighten the monetary supply when necessary. Thirdly, and I'm very surprised that they tell us this, that bailouts are just somehow bad, and they tell us that bailouts are bad because you have less money that you can put into social services. Bailouts are important in mitigating the impact of asset bubbles. Why is that so? Number one, you prevent a contagion effect because when one bank fails, you reduce the number of banks that can do interbank lending to each other, which means that more banks fail. And when this happens, more consumers lose access to credit and basic resources that they need to be able to upkeep a basic standard of living in the very first place. But number two, you allow companies and basic institutions to be able to continually lend from these banks, your small and medium enterprises, to be able to upkeep their basic company and their basic production of services. This is not only important for the owners of small and medium enterprises, but also for basic consumers as well, being able to access these goods and services. The importance of this argument, I think, is twofold. Number one, asset bubbles hurt the average consumer heavily. When they burst, people lose lifelong savings when they put into things like mortgage-backed investments. When people end up being homeless because they cannot pay back their mortgage, these are things that have tangible impacts on the ground that we're talking about. But secondly, I think this has an intergenerational effect in deterring foreign direct investment, especially for countries which need to be able to develop and build investing credibility. I think in having governmental intervention is necessary to be able to deal with this. I think ultimately this shows why we flip opening government on their head.
Right.
Second argument on why we allow developing countries to escape the middle income trap, I'll take Ocean.
You're just delaying the inevitable. When these companies have the expectation of being bailed out, they engage in responsible services. If the government can't take the debt to bail them out, then the crisis just happens earlier.
So I think they're sort of like misconstruing the case here. I'm talking about why governments and nations don't have the incentive to overspend. But I think for companies as a whole, I think it's just a basic knowledge that once you build up enough capital to be able to reach economies of scale, you'll be able to get profit and revenue in the end, which is you'll be able to pay off the debt in the very first place. I don't understand why just because you loan money you cannot pay the debt. Companies have the ability to pay off debt when they generate enough money in the very first place to be able to fulfill the debt obligations at the very start. It's just basic economies of scale. As you grow bigger as a company, you are able to cut costs, you are able to cut production costs, you are able to generate maybe greater revenue by catering to a larger market base. Second argument on why we allow developing countries to escape the middle income trap. Why is Hayekian economics just terrible for developing countries? Number one, very important, constant monetary policy, which means that your currency for developing countries, you cannot be altered to be able to increase export competitiveness, you cannot decrease interest rate, you cannot depreciate your currency to be able to increase your export competitiveness. This is oftentimes very important for developing countries whose majority of their market is export-oriented in the very first place, which is that it has significant impact if their exports cannot compete with other rivaling countries. Secondly, limited budget deficits. Note here, panel, developing economies at the very start of their economic development will never be able to create sufficient budget surpluses because number one, there's a lack of a centralized tax system in these countries in the very first place. They can't really connect much money from people. But number two, the population just has low purchasing power, which is at the very start of the development, you just have very limited access to money in the very first place. It's where you need this access to capital in the very first place. note here that opening opposition tells you that you need capital, but we tell you why uniquely they don't have access to this capital when you are a developing country starting off at a very low base, which means that in developing countries, spending on domestic production and on building capital is close to minimal if you don't have the access to credit that we are able to get on our side of the house when you are able to spend more and loan more to be able to put more into spending in the very first place. But thirdly, because developing countries can't get access to credit, they need to be able to build capital for domestic production in the future, because once they earn profits in the long run, this is how they are able to pay back their debt in the very first place. Two impacts. Number one, we allow developing countries to escape the middle income trap insofar as they progress their economy sufficiently and they're able to earn the revenue needed to pay off the government debt. But secondly, developing countries are not able to attract foreign direct investment insofar as they get more coverage. They're the more vulnerable actor in the debate. But more importantly, on both sides of the house, if you are a developed economy, these policies don't really affect you anyways. I think the biggest delta here is the most vulnerable countries which need the most amount of economic support. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Now, like the last bit of the government.
Very close
I know. But that's important.
yeah. You have to grab.
Thank you.
Pozdrawiam mamę, Kubę i Tosię. Jesteście super. Okay. Please don't do verbal POIs. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I'm really glad I'm economic dummy because that is what makes Piotr explaining actual case and being the only one that is not bullshitting on this round. Okay. Now starting with comparison with our OG, which will be a criterion who can explain things and make econ actually work. What OG is actually doing? Firstly, they are buzzwording stuff and they are not comparative, in the sense that they are not showing why it is actually going to be better on our side, and they are not linking their stuff specifically to how they are going to do things. Like, I'm hearing, oh, bubbles and then no jobs, and they don't really understand how it works. Also, on the probability case, their case works in logic, which is, oh, okay, the way they are proving stuff is government spending money, the whole country goes brrr. This is massive bullshit, and this is not laughing because it is like a factual bullshit. Like, we are debating both about good countries and bad countries. They are debating both about Finland and Greece, and we are debating both about, I don't know, like, what is the libertarian utopia thing about it, or libertarian bullshit? This is what this debate is about. So they are not actually proving the probability of their cases, and in the real world you see that it is not always working like this. What we are proving on our side, and why we are better than our opening, we are firstly showing you the particular risk that we are removing. We are showing you the particular risk that is inherent to government doing things. Why is that? Because governments found bubbles as they are an electoral time crunch to create jobs and so on. They are creating bad infrastructure as they have no time for research, and this is inherent whether government is stupid or not, whether they have good incentives or not. This is something that they cannot overcome, so it will always be the risk on our side, and this is what we are explaining to you. So we are way closer to the motion proving that it is actually happening. We are showing you why it is actually happening, they are never showing you that. Secondly, we are showing you how it exactly works and how we can solve it by this specific part of economic policy. And thirdly, we are linking our impact to the mechanism and showing you how it is actually influencing people's lives on our side. And now, why the suffering in terms of crisis is more important than any development and any other stability impact, actually any impact. Firstly, people are actually incapable of doing any stuff to cope with it. That means that you are in a situation when your life is literally at risk. This is what was happening in 2008. This is the massive crisis that are influencing people's lives to the fullest. We think that even if this is something that is happening rarely, it is something that it is so big harm that we should prevent it at any cost, and this is only happening on our side. But also suffering is much deeper than the happiness on all the golf bench. What is that? First, people are getting used to nice stuff. You are getting a bit of more of development, and then you are not feeling the actual impact. But at the end of the day, all the impacts are between happiness and sadness. And now I'm explaining you why you should prefer limiting sadness to making happiness greater. Secondly, people are suffering is something that is way more proximate to you and that you are feeling more. That means that if you don't have a job, if your job is at risk, if you cannot provide for you, your family, your children and so on, you are thinking about this all the time. This is your major issue. This is something that is happening in your brain all the time. It is not only on the mental level, but this is also on your life quality. This is all, you cannot afford basic stuff. You cannot buy yourself things. You cannot buy yourself food. You are actually at the deepest suffering and so on. But also, when they are proving that there's going to be more development, first they've never linked how it is actually influencing people's lives, but also, even if you are going to be a bit more happy with something good happening to you, you are always going to want more and more. That means that people will still not be satisfied, will still not be feeling that they are getting enough. When you already have something, you want to have more and more. I wanted to have 14 points at Euros, but now I would like to pray. That's how people work. And we think that they've never proved why this something is more important. We're proving you why this suffering is important. Yeah.
The way you just did shows that unemployment, because you don't have growth, is more proximate. Companies lowering wages and harming the poor is more proximate compared to the asset bubbles that happen 5% of the time. So you just did our way for us.
No. Why is that? We think that this development is first, as Peter already explained, happening on both sides. We already have something in this economy that is working. We think that the stable development, even if it's less, is something that is way more important than strong development. We prefer work when everyone has a bit and it's kind of basic and not great, and you are defining the word when we are striving for the great and so on. And why is this still happening on both sides? We think that companies also have interest and incentives to provide all of this development. You need infrastructure for the private companies to work. You need these roads, you need this education and so on. If you have big companies that are not limited by government intervention, that means that they are probably investing in all that stuff, and this is probably still happening on both sides. But secondly, you are giving alternative for us. We can, money from taxes is fair enough. And you say, oh, but you're going to tax poor people and so on. We think that this is less harm than crisis. Why? Because you are getting used to taxes, because you are managing your budget knowing that you have to pay tax, so you can distribute your money normally and you can sustain yourself. On our side, this is happening quickly. This is happening suddenly when you are losing your job right now and you have no capacity to do anything with that. So we can also have development from all the tax money. You've told that, so this is on our side. And also accountability rights and stuff. I think this is absolutely out of the debate. Why? Because this debate isn't anarcho-capitalism versus communist utopia. It is strictly only about economics. We think that things as ecology, as workers' rights, are more of the social stuff which government are doing or not doing symmetrically on both sides of the house. You can have progressive government on our side. You can have also conservative government on their side. This is out of the motion. And now going to CO. CO is saying, oh no, bubbles are actually on our side. Why is that not true? Because they are falling into the same mistake of anarcho-capitalism versus communist utopia. Piotr is showing you why this is actually what this policy aims for, and why this is happening strictly on our side when governments are not doing stupid mistakes which are inherent to their type of economics. We think that only on our side we're actually proving you all of these bubbles. That means that we are winning this class with them. And about the developing countries, we think that
I'd like to speak on the speech, and I'd like to invite the last speaker for the opposition.
I have an incredibly large amount of respect for all of the teams in this round, and so I'm going to do something my mom told me how to do. I'm going to take each team at their best and explain why even then we're able to beat them. I want to start off by firstly engaging on the case that we've just had, the case of the present government. I think unfortunately, as Rick claims, a lot of their mechanization falls slightly on our side insofar as they unfairly define the way in which free market economies exist. They unfairly overstep onto our side of the house when they illustrate how honestly Keynesian economic defines regulation, the ability of governments to regulate asset bubbles to a reasonable degree happen. If that is true, I want to engage their sole positive claim, which is that there exist free market incentives for people to generate things like infrastructure, one of the few benefits that they do try to respond to on closing opposition's case. I want to talk about how private investment is manufactured some level of infrastructure in the developing world. This is the sort of thing that you only see roads being developed on the way to mining towns and nowhere else in rural countries. You see the individuals or the usage of these things by civilians or non-private companies often be things like being taxed severely or having massive tolls usage. But in the instances where these economic activities fail, you see these companies divesting significantly, no incentive of maintenance, and the honest reality is that you don't get a level of reasonable access to infrastructure over time, and where it does happen, it is so exclusive that it benefits no one, but the individuals are literally extracting capital out of the ground, like Kyoto says. Then I think you need to contend more genuinely with their exact claims. They say that you directly have a greater ability to stop overstimulation. This is a bit of a crazy claim for a number of reasons. The first reason is the tool that they describe is the tool which Keynesian economics defines as the mechanism of solving for things like asset bubbles. Look at your notes in terms of what Rick brings you. He shows how explicitly your ability to create short-term regulation and stop the over-evaluation that Kyoto speaks about happen under the framework that is definitionally in our side as per the info slide. But I think maybe that's not a good enough response, and maybe you buy their framework here. And you do, like the closing opposition groups, government group says, you buy this idea that individuals have an ability or we should like create some level of like weighing based on proximity to suffering. In our world, the government is the only individual that has invested investment in the individual struggle of individuals. You have a massive capacity to create and mitigate suffering, but moreover than that, in their world, when you're unable to stop these phenomena, people literally lose their life savings. Individuals lose their homes. This is the impact that you have to weigh on. It isn't about people's ability to feel rich or poor. It's about their literal ability to like buy money and put food on the table for their families. I think this meaningfully removes the closing government from the debate. Let's then move to the team in the government. And this is incredibly important because I think they do a lot of work, but I think a lot of it unfortunately doesn't pass the veil of basic. No, that's rude. I wasn't going to say that. In the opening government team, what do we have? I think two main claims. The first claim, with a bunch of mechanisms, is that the government will do Keynesian economics badly. I would feel like inherently or extension legislates why in the post-2008 world, there is massive international incentives on every actor in the world. Look at EU policy that necessitates the European Union make sure the deficit spending never goes overboard again. Look at the USA policy that Rick flags, which I probably think probably generally exists. But more specifically, in the instance of what the House describes as important developing nations, IMF loans are contingent on the ability to regulate your country and make sure that there is a limit on deficit spending. This gives us a sure and realistic level of examples to point back on to illustrate that we've literally changed the way these things work. But let's look at an actual example about countries that have done one or the other approach. Look at a place like South Africa that has been an approach, implemented the approach of the government venture at large. They're a country that now has one of the greatest inequality rates in the world, has massive levels of state and corporate capture, and a free market that is basically unregulatable. Why? Because you have, like Rick describes, massive lobbying capacity that removes the ability and incentive of the government to be accountable to some degree. Of course, there might be some degree of like symmetry of harm here, but you literally have nothing in the toolbox, right? You open it up and you just cry because you have no alternative here. I don't want to know what happens then in the instance where you have a country like Rwanda that steps in often and meaningfully to generate a level of construction. This is a country that 2 decades ago literally was just coming out of a bloody genocide and now has one of the highest economic growth rates in Africa. How did this happen? It is the meaningful creation and reasonable implementation of things like deficit spending to generate things like public transport systems that unlock things like open opposition says. But note here, there is a slight gap in the way in which they, how they're able to illustrate an active harm on the economics of the government side. This is incredibly important, and it's where there's a first level of separation. I'll talk about when I speak about the lovely team and opening opposition a bit less. What is the second claim that they have? No. You said that people and companies respond poorly to this. And I want to note a few things about people and companies here. It is important to note that when you give companies the ability, to create some level of immediate economic profit, they have an incentive to not want to redline their books continuously, always be in debt over and over and over. Instead, they have an incentive to pay off those debts and push towards things like research and development. This is something that uniquely happens when you have the tools of the opposition bench. And I think this is the last claim that I'd like to respond to with the opening opposition. It's not how people respond to this. Fundamentally, panel, the impact that you need to understand here is that when you see these companies failing, because the opening government says that you are so used to bailouts that you expect to fail, you literally lose things like consumer happiness. Why would you go to a bank that's crashed before? Why would you take out a mortgage from a company or a real estate company that can't back those loans? It is literally the inability. There's so many multiple incentives that reflect why individuals will opt out of these things and massively create some level of positive benefit. But more than that, people are actually quite happy with things like quantitative easing. They know in the short term that they're happy to create some level of, the wallet feels a bit emptier, but they still get a salary every month. Yeah, the government is able to cap things like inflation and create meaningful change. This means that individuals much prefer a stable salary from a company that still exists as opposed to a company that literally goes bankrupt over time.
Bailout means the government is absorbing private risk. This is more than you can tax deductively, so eventually you'll have to take on more and more debt. You cannot regulate it. It's eventually the bubble.
Brother, I understand. You're not getting the nuance of rich brings in the extension. That the value of the world that we live in today gives us an understanding that there are meaningful capacity and incentives to do this. It's been done, and arguably was. I think you needed to reference our extension if you wanted to try and beat us on that claim specifically. Let's then go move to address the open opposition team, a team that's incredibly dense in terms of analysis. And I think we beat them on the three things that they mentioned. The first one is development happening. Again, it's a little bit uncertain because they only reference two things. They reference the ability of Sri Lanka to create some level of change. Here they illustrate the ability of FDI. This is significantly uncertain, and I think here the more certain ability to do this is through things like the maintenance or regulation of asset bubbles. This uniquely and certainly comes in the closing opposition. On sustainability, the exact same thing. But more than this, I think I want to note here, asset bubbles happen frequently in the world absence of these economic policies, and therefore it is the benefit of Rick's analysis that creates the level of certainty they're contingent on. The last one on fairness, and I think this is just not important. The game is about creating a meaningful benefit to people's lives, and I don't really care how it happens. I don't really care who pays for it. I care that people are actually kept safe and have some level of financial money in the back. What do we have then from Rick and what is the extension? Make sure that we're doing this debate for everyone. Honestly, it's the level of clarity and rigor. It is the understanding that unless you have a market that you can meaningfully interact with, corporate forces and lobbying and evil forces of capitalism will always put you in a position where you have no ability to create any level of meaningful change. For people to unlock their benefits, you don't only need the investment, but you need the ability to keep people safe.
Debate and for finishing the preliminary round. So first of all, shake hands and have the rest. No problem. Very quickly and hopefully someone
The guy comes in a bit.
That's probably